Донбасс, в Украину мы вернем, а всех предателей мы быстренько прибьем.
Hello and welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. I'm honored to speak today once again to our guest, Sergii Grabskyi, a colonel in reserve in the Ukrainian military, who has unique, insightful views on this war by virtue of his experience and being based in Ukraine. So, Sergei, when we last talked to you in September, that was after a very successful counteroffensive by the Ukrainian military in the north, in the Kharkiv region. And since then, we had another very successful offensive taking back part of Kherson Oblast and the city of Kherson. Now you have these major battles taking place in the Donbass with Bakhmut that's been taking place since early in the summer time frame. There are some reports that the Russians are making progress around Vulhledar with Wagner Group by Prigozhin taking the offensive there. Where do things stand really, and where do you see them going right now?
If you're talking about like a general concept of operation, I'm talking about like all line of contact. I would say that there is only one small portion where Russian forces now try to continue the offensive actions. And we are talking about a minor section between Vulhledar and Klishchiivka, I can say, which all of belong to so-called Bakhmut stronghold. And Russians try to achieve even one single victory just to break the line of losses over there and surroundings over there. In other locations, we do not observe any serious activity of Russian forces which may show any attempts of other offensive actions. And if we will pay attention to north from Bakhmut, I would like to concentrate on the section of the front line between Svatove and Kreminna, where Ukrainian forces continues steady offensive actions. And now we are talking about approaching to the Kreminna city, and it make like positions available for further development of offensive operations in the direction of so-called northern Lugansk region. And it is one quite important point. And also, I don't know why, but most of attention of mass media, of journalists or other observers attracted to the Bakhmut Vulhledar section. However, I would like to pay your attention to Vulhledar actually, where we have a quite interesting situation. Why? From my point of view, Vulhledar looks even more important for all concept of defensive actions of of Russian forces, because of taking of Vulhledar by Russians will mean that Russians will push back the threat of permanent influence to the ground logistic lines, which supported to so-called Southern Front of Russian Federation. And for Ukrainian defense forces, as we call them now, it is interesting position where we can develop an offensive action destroying Russian defense in that particular location. And on another wing of our south front, I would like to pay attention to so-called left bank of the river Dnieper and or as I call it usually Kherson triangle, which means in my definition temporary occupied Kherson Oblast, I mean left bank of the river Dnieper, which belonged to the Kherson Oblast. And
the eastern bank.
Sorry, it's a difference in our description. We normally use like a left or right bank, yes. But from geographical perspective, it's an eastern bank, indeed. Well, and when we are talking about that eastern bank of the river Dnieper and in Kherson Oblast in particular, if you will pay attention to the map, you will see that that eastern bank is almost under fire control of Ukrainian defense forces. What does it mean in practice? It means that Russians are not able to create sufficient lines of defense over there because they suffer from permanent Ukrainian attacks, and they can't concentrate enough troops, enough resources, ammunition, and fuel, for instance, in that direction. What does it mean in a nearest perspective? It means it is a case when Ukrainian forces may advance in that direction, and I would like to nominate our next target, and that next target has a name, Melitopol. Melitopol is very important for all composition of the south direction because of retaking or liberation, as we call it from Ukrainian perspective. Liberation of Melitopol will means breaking of so-called ground corridor between Russian Federation and Crimea. And who knows, maybe a successful offensive of Ukrainian forces will reach to not only to the borders of Crimea, but to the lands of Crimea. And we will enter on shoulders of our enemies to Crimea and will develop that offensive actions, which will make incredibly high impact to all structure of Kremlin regime. Because of, Kremlin always says that Crimea is like a holy land or heartland of Russian Federation. It must be part of Russia and so on and so on. But it looks like they are not able to protect it at the moment, and that is why I know I may look a little bit cynic, but in my perspective, it looks like Ukrainian forces try to attract as much as possible attention and forces to so-called that narrow section and small section between Vulhledar, Bakhmut, and Klishchiivka in Donetsk, to exhausting Russian forces and prevent them from developing of so-called offensive groups of troops on other directions. And
so there's a lot.
Sergei,
so there's a lot to unpack here. So let's take it one at a time. So I want to come back to Bakhmut for a second, because there's been a perception in the West here, including in the government and the media, that this offensive by the Russians in Bakhmut is pointless, that the city doesn't hold much value. But what I've heard from some of the folks fighting in Bakhmut on the Ukrainian side is that it is actually really important, because if the Russians manage to take Bakhmut, then their positions, the Ukrainian positions in Siversk and Vulhledar, potentially get cut off, and it becomes much easier to advance on Kramatorsk and Slovansk. Do you agree with that? Is there a real threat that if the Russians manage to take Bakhmut, that it would endanger Ukrainian positions in the rest of the Donetsk Oblast?
I could say partially. I could partially be agreed with that because of, technically, if we will glance on the map, on current map, capture of Bakhmut by Russians will not affect Ukrainian positions so much as we could imagine, or some of our guys may describe, because of it made sense before when Russians had a group of troops in Izium. Well, from that perspective, from latest May, maybe June, or beginning of July, simultaneous offensive of Russian forces from the north, from Izium to south to Sloviansk, and from the south from Bakhmut to the north, may create a huge problem for Ukrainian forces defending that part of Lugansk Oblast. But now, if you will glance on the map, you wouldn't find any specific threats for Ukrainian forces. Moreover, I could say that the Ukrainian forces created during the long period of war, 8 years, more than 8 years, almost 9 years, a well-developed network and zone of defensive positions over there. So even withdrawal from Bakhmut right now will mean that Russians, after a couple kilometers, will face with another strongholds and defensive position of Ukrainian armed forces. Moreover, for some reason, Bakhmut now like a symbol of resistance. And as I said before, Bakhmut, I'm talking about not only Bakhmut, but Bakhmut, Vulhledar, and Klishivka. It's like a one district, military district and stronghold in general. So it looks like as soon as Ukrainian forces will keep it, and it would make sense to keep those positions. Why? Because of we have an experience of Popasna, we have an experience of Volnovakha and Novotoshkivsk, where Russians completely and 100% destroyed all of those locations. What does it mean from military perspective? You can't even restore your defensive lines over there, your defensive position. So it would not make any sense just to protect those fully destroyed and demolished lines and positions. From that perspective, Ukrainian forces could withdraw, but till we are able just to keep the line of defense, we will do that. Why? Because of it is a part of task of a defensive operation. Exhaust offensive troops, defeat them, and stop them on their positions. And that is why I could say that the reason of keeping the so-called Bakhmut line at that moment at this moment is about just to attract more and more Russian forces and chop them, if I may, to use such a symbol to definition, to chop them in that district and exhaust them from operational and strategic perspective, which will create some options, as I mentioned before, for Ukrainian offensive in other directions. This is the reason why we. Excuse me, let me finish because it's very important from my perspective. This is the first position. And second one, I had quite often chats with my boys who are now in Bakhmut, and they said, Sergei, of course, from military perspective, we can make step back just to withdraw to another position. But listen, it's a bloody almost 10 months of the war. We can't withdraw every time. We have to stop Russians over there and push them back from our lands. This is let's say, a mental point of the defense.
Now that makes total sense. Is there another reason, though? Two friends of the podcast, Mike Kaufman, who we've met, and Rob Lee, have written a paper recently talking about how the offensive in the Donbass in late spring and summer of this year was in part responsible for the successes that the Ukrainians have had in Kharkiv and Kherson, because it exhausted so much of the Russian offensive capacity, both ammunition supplies and manpower. So could this be yet another reason to hold Bakhmut and to make them exhaust their forces and munitions and prevent them from being able to take on the offensive in the spring?
It is absolutely correct conclusion, I have to say, because of this is what I'm talking about. We are doing defensive actions. We try to exhaust Russian forces. Moreover, we achieve a result because of even, let's say, external observers stated that Russians decrease intensity of artillery fire roughly in 2 or 3 times. Somehow for 60%. That is why it's a reasonable price which we are paying for our defense and potential offensive actions of Ukrainian army. And let me come back a little bit to the Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. If you remember the situation, after desperate clashes, Ukrainian forces withdrew from those locations. But what was the next step of Russians? Zero steps, because they tried to reach to Bilohorivka, and then they were pushed back and stopped. And there is no even one single movement from that time, let's say mid of July till now, on that section of the front line. It may be the same. Moreover, if you will use, let's say, geographical map of that region, I'm talking about the Donetsk region, you will see that the Russian offensive in that direction is pointless because of that location. The geography of that location is like a highly urbanized territory. where Russians are not able to use their strong parts or strong prevalences such as artillery, tanks, and massive attacks. They must to cut their troops in a small portion of troops, like they call it assault groups, but in fact assault group means like a platoon. And they have to exhaust themselves using those platoons without any artillery support, any tank supply support, and aviation support. So it's like a terrible battle coming back to the World War I. But the count and the balance between losses of Ukrainian forces and Russian forces is uncomparable, because of Russians as an offensive part or offensive side lose more and more, much more troops than Ukrainian do.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the north now that you've mentioned, the Luhansk Oblast. So we spent time talking about Donetsk. So that's where the Ukrainians are on the counteroffensive, as you said, in Kreminna and Svatove. So why do those cities matter? So if Bakhmut is kind of a pointless offensive for the Russians because of defense and depth lines that would prevent them from making further gains, if Ukraine is able to take Kreminna, does that open up possibility for taking much more of the Luhansk Oblast? Do the Russians have the defense and depth fortifications there?
Indeed. This is a reason. And there are two key points in that direction. I'm talking about Svatove and Kreminna. Kreminna is a suburb of a so-called urban conglomerate, as we call it, Rubizhne, Severodonetsk, and Lysychansk. And taking that location, taking that town, we will open the door or gates to development of offensive to the, let's say, second line of Russian defense. Second line of Russian defense is Starobelsk and Vulhledar. And it will cut off supply lines from Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which will make a position where Ukrainian forces would be able just to liberate those locations, which fully terminate all achievements of Russian offensive during the spring and summer time. This is a so-called south flank, and in case of development of Ukrainian offensive to the northeast, to the direction of Starobelsk, and recapturing or liberation of Svatove, we will have a situation where a liberation of north of the Lugansk Oblast or Lugansk region will be reason of time only. And
that geography is not deeply populated, right? It's very foresty, so you don't have necessarily a lot of Russian forces there.
Yeah, they don't have, first of all, they don't have a lot of Russian forces there, and it is technically difficult in such a short period of time to create a real strongholds and defense lines as Russians declared. In fact, we found it's like a toy defensive systems, as we call it there, because of, those tooth of dragon does not look like a real one. I can compare it with the German ones, which Germans did during this First and Second World War on the West. But I have to note that Russians clearly understand the situation which may happen and which may take place in that direction, and that is why we observe a huge concentration of Russian troops in Svatove as let's say, last point of defense, and we observe permanent deployment of troops and supplies, ammunition, armament on the direction from Starobelsk to Svatove. Moreover, Ukrainian intelligence services and, let's say, open sources, let's call it open sources, discover a big concentration of Russian troops in the zone of Rovinki, which belongs to the Belgorod Oblast of Russian Federation, neighboring to the Lugansk Oblast of Ukraine. It means that Russians understand an importance of keeping of that region under control, and we may anticipate quite serious clashes over there. If Russians would be able to deploy enough troops there. But critical and key point is if they would be able to deploy enough troops.
Okay, and then the other part of the Ukrainian offensive that you mentioned is Vulhledar, which is in the southern part of Donetsk Oblast and sort of directly north of Mariupol. And does that present an opportunity to try to do an offensive and retake Mariupol if Vulhledar falls?
Well, actually, it is not about retaking Mariupol because of, I beg my pardon, it doesn't make any sense. To retake what? To retake fully destroyed location which previously called Mariupol? Well, from military perspective at this moment, it doesn't make any sense.
But you would also cut off the land bridge to Crimea, right?
Yes. This is another option to cut off a land bridge to Crimea, or corridor as we call it. Why? Because right now, the importance of Vulhledar position is because of Ukrainian forces are able to make an influence to Rozivka and Volnovakha, two key points on the railway, but you should remember that the railway is a backbone of Russian logistics. And Russians strongly rely on railways as the main support and supply lines over there. So right now, Ukrainian forces are able to influence those two key points. And in addition to that, long-range artillery and missiles are able to hit positions and lines of communication of Russian troops on approaches and in suburbs of Mariupol. What does it mean in fact? In fact, Russians right now are able to use only one road running from Rostov through the Mariupol to Berdyansk, close to the seaside. And this is it. Only one road, which also makes their positions quite weak in that direction. This is a key point for Russians.
Well, also because the Crimean bridge is still under repair and the rail line seems to be stopped. This is the key resupply ground lines of communication for the Russian forces in that region, right?
Yes, that's true. Frankly speaking, to be perfectly honest with you, I have been shocked why Russians are not able just to recover traffic capacity of the Crimea bridge in certain period of time. They are not able, which also shows a very weak position from the perspective of logistics supply and support lines. It shocked me, but reality is play for Ukraine. What I'm talking about, it's about like a possibility to move ahead and advance to the Azov seaside. And what will it mean from military perspective? It will mean that we can't stop calling the Crimea semi-peninsula as a real air carrier of Russian Federation, and will be like a exercise field for Ukrainian artillery and missiles.
Okay, so the other place you mentioned is Melitopol, which is, as you said, right in between the lines of communication for the Russians, going north to Zaporizhia, going east to Berdyansk and Mariupol, going west towards Kherson, and going south towards Crimea. However, it's inland from the river, so reaching is hard. So, the two options are crossing the river from the western bank of Kherson Oblast to the eastern bank, or trying to get around it and going south from Zaporizhia. What do you think is the most likely alternative? There's been a lot of talk that this small island in the city of Kherson, Veliki Potomkin, that apparently the Ukrainians have retaken, could be an opportunity for them to actually cross the river and get on the eastern side of the bank of the river and continue the offensive there. Do you think that's realistic, or is the
it is
north to south offensive?
Unrealistic. Mm-hmm. It is absolutely unrealistic because of even Russian withdrawal from the western bank of Dnieper shows that any crossing of the river by any part of the conflict looks absolutely unrealistic. Destroying of all lines of communication, I'm talking about the bridges and dam, between west and east bank, means that Ukrainian forces are not able just to conduct any real offensive operations crossing the river because there is no capabilities to sustain attacking troops. With that regard, I would like to pay attention to another perspective, and I quite frankly speaking, I was mentioning it a little bit. We are talking about the permanent destroying of Russian command and control posts, concentration of troops, warehouses, and military depots on the eastern bank of the river Dnieper from the western bank without crossing the river. To create an option when Ukrainian forces would be able, after quite significant destroying of all positions of Russian forces on the eastern bank, to conduct a frontal offensive operation from the line of Vasilievka or Rikhiv-Gulay-Pole to direction of Tokmak and Melitopol. And don't forget, and many maps mention that the Ukrainian resistance forces, or partisans as we call it, insurgents, are quite active in that districts. So it will be like a double impact from outside and from inside of Russian defensive zone, which may, and well, not may, I am confident it will destroy Russian defense over there, and will create possibilities for development of offensive Russian or Ukrainian troops to the direction of Azov Sea.
Let's talk about that offensive, because we had some big news, good news coming for Ukraine in the last week or so, where you had both the Germans, the French, and the Americans agreeing to supply infantry fighting vehicles, MX-10P from the French, Bradleys from the Americans, Mortars from the Germans, although some countries try to spin it as light tanks. They're really infantry fighting vehicles. And then there's news in the last day or so that the UK is considering sending Challenger 2 tanks, actual main battle tanks, although in very small numbers, about 10 of them. And what it looks to me like is that this is really an attempt to pressure the Germans to send Leopard 2 tanks that are much more beneficial and usable by the Ukrainians versus the Challengers and the M1 Abrams from the US. But the Germans have made it very clear that they don't want to be the first ones to supply the tanks or the only ones. So this is an attempt to kind of get everyone to come on board, just like they did with infantry fighting vehicles. How big of a deal is that for the Ukrainian offensive potentials across all of these fronts that we've just discussed?
It's not so big deal. At that particular stage, it is not a so big deal. Why? Because I would like to glance on it from another perspective. We received a lot of tanks. We received a lot of infantry battle vehicles and APCs and artillery system. But the key point, what type of those tanks, vehicles and other things? Russian or Soviet type. It means that we used, and frankly speaking, I may state that we exhausted all options of using of post-Soviet armament and equipment, and now we are on the initial stage of replacing of old Soviet stuff by the Western stuff, as we call it. So, and this transferring and this delivery of such a numbers of armored vehicles is like a first initial stage of replacement. From exact or practical military perspective, it does not make a critical sense for nearest or closest Ukrainian offensive actions. Because of the percentage of Western military equipment would be not enough just to allow us to say that okay, guys, we are able to conduct that offensive because we have a certain number of Western armament and equipment. But it is a very important gesture, and it is, I would like to say, the December transfer is like a key point and turn point in all war between Ukraine and Russia, when the Western states started to deploy their ammunition and their armament to the field. So, in conclusion, I could say that yes, each of these vehicles or tanks is very helpful for Ukrainian armed forces, but in perspective. Indeed, we will use it widely, but in the future, we will replace all of our staff by the Western staff, and it will create a huge advance of Ukrainian armed forces to compare with Russian armed forces.
So it's all about the numbers, right? So I believe your Chief of General Staff, Zaluzhny, said that he needs about 300 tanks. You know, it's not clear if Ukraine is going to get that many, given that Germany, for example, has about 240 total Leopard 2 tanks. Obviously, they're not going to give everything. There are some other countries that have them as well, but it's going to be tough, I think, to get to the numbers that he's asking for. But one reason I think that movement to Western tanks is important is that I presume, just like with your artillery pieces, you're starting to run out of ammunition for the Soviet tanks, that they use the 125 millimeter smooth bore shells versus the 120 millimeter Western shells. So that's going to become an issue for you, even if you still have lots of tanks, because I know you've captured a lot of them from Russia as well.
Absolutely. And also, there is another quite important thing which must be taken into consideration. Support and supply and maintenance and supply. What was the reason to deploy a lot of post-Soviet armament and ammunition and equipment to Ukraine? Because of Ukraine has already developed support and supply chains and system. And, it was a clear and quite interesting example. What can we do as a Ukrainian armed forces with Western armament? And good example was about the Panzer howitzers of Germany, because of after a certain period of exploring, using them, we were forced to deploy it back to Germany for repair and maintenance. In case of howitzers, it doesn't make so significant impact as it may be in case of tanks, because of practically tank looks more vulnerable tool on the battlefield to compare with howitzer, because of tank always operate on the front line. So, and even from the mathematic perspective, anticipation of hitting of tank much higher than artillery system. So in practice, what does it mean? After one battle, we have to move back to Germany or to United Kingdom those tanks for maintenance and repair. Come on. Does it make any sense? We may create all of those chains of support and supply, maintenance and repair in place just to make it quicker, to make that equipment more efficient. And that is why that small portion does not look like a joke from British side, for instance. It's a good test and a good opportunity for Ukrainian armed forces or defense forces just to test their ability to repair and operate with that partially small number of armament, which will make a way to expansion of using of armament and equipment of the Western part or Western countries in Ukrainian reality.
So I imagine being a mechanic, a maintenance and logistics person in the Ukrainian military right now is one of the toughest jobs, because you literally have the Noah's Ark of weapons, 2 of each kind of pretty much everything that people have been donating to you, and maintaining that, keeping it running and fixing it, it must be just an absolute nightmare. How are the folks keeping up with it?
Well, you're absolutely right. When I have a chance to speak with my colleagues from the logistic department, they said we are survive now in a situation of real nightmare, logistic nightmare, because it is not about only two main division, I mean Soviet and the Western types of armamented equipment. Even those howitzers with a caliber 155 millimeters has a specifics, and trust me, it's quite big differences in maintenance and repair between German, Polish, Swedish, and for instance French howitzers. You can imagine what is that. So it's a miracle for my guys to deal with that. They do their best just to make sure that they would be able to operate with that equipment. And moreover, I spoke with some of them and they said, we made some improvements to use that stuff because of, we now expand capability of each howitzer, not each howitzer, but some of them in 2 or maybe 3 times. So it's about the deheating of barrels. It's about like recoil systems and so on. They did a great job, and now we should start thinking about deploy specialists from the Western countries how to deal with the different types of armament and equipment in real field conditions, resisting like a real threat of Russian quite old, but still operating stuff there.
Let me ask you about another weapons platform. We've seen since February 24 this incremental approach to providing more weapon systems. Obviously, the dam breaking on infantry fighting vehicles now, maybe tanks. The one thing that has still not been discussed significantly is fighter jets. And this has been a real puzzling thing for me because even though the Ukrainian Air Force has done a marvelous job keeping their planes flying, the conditions in which they're flying, we've had a podcast with folks from the RUSI UK think tank, Justin Bronk and Jack Watling, who said that, because they're flying at such low altitudes, the pressure on the airframes is so massive that you're going to have some real problems keeping these planes operational over the next year. So you're going to have to move to Western jets at some point, and it's been a puzzle to me why the discussions have not yet started on training your pilots on appropriate jets, thinking which jets are most capable. Justin Bronk from RUSI believes that the Gripens from the Swedish military are the most appropriate given the state of your runways, and that the F-16 is just too finicky to operate in those conditions. What are you hearing from the Ukrainian side about the fighter jet situation and how critical it is? Because it seems to me like if you're going to launch a major offensives, if you can actually establish air dominance, that would make the whole problem much, much easier to resolve.
Establishing of air dominance is a key point of any offensive. Moreover, if you are thinking about, let's say, offensive on the south, we should realize that the Russians have a well-developed and extended airfield network in Crimea. So it will be quite a difficult option for us just to take an advantage over the Russian aviation over there. And it doesn't matter how many Challengers or Leopard 2 or other tanks will be in the field. Without air coverage, it will not make any sense. And you're definitely right, just that it is additional or another iteration of our discussion with our Western allies. And the reason is mostly the same as we have discussed already with armament and Western tanks. Maintenance and supply and repair system in place, which makes the deployment of Western aviation even more complicated to compare with tanks and other stuff there. And indeed, it's quite difficult. It will take much more time just to prepare crews of those fighter jets. in Ukrainian armed forces, and as an additional perspective, we must to determine which type of air jet could be the most sufficient for Ukrainian armed forces. You can imagine, we have discussed already that situation with a logistic nightmare in case of artillery. You can imagine what will happen if we will start deploy different types of air jets to Ukraine. So this is a reason of thinking twice about the financial efficiency and battle efficiency.
Do you have a view on which jet would be most beneficial to you? Is it the Gripen? Is it the F-16?
Well, I'm not an expert in air forces, so I have no clue about it. I have only one confidence. We strongly need it. We strongly need air jets. But what type? I beg your pardon, I am not an expert.
So let me ask you a couple of questions on Crimea. So one, now that you have control of the Western Bank, presumably the North Crimean Canal that supplies the water to Ukraine can be targeted by your artillery on the Western Bank. And that was a key priority for the Ukrainians when the Russians first occupied Crimea, to turn off the water to Crimea. The Russians blew up that dam that was put in place once they captured that territory in February and March. But is it possible to destroy that canal with artillery right now from the Western Bank, or no?
No, it is impossible, and it doesn't make any sense. First of all, that canal does not operate properly. Because of after 8 years of occupation, the system and network of that canal almost destroyed. And Russian may blew up whatever they want, the dam, and shows that the water is running now to Crimea, but in fact it is not. That water disappear in lands of the northern Crimea without reaching to the southern part of Crimea. Because of, it's like a difference in attitude between different parts of that channel, and pumping stations were completely destroyed during the initial period of occupation, first 8 years of occupation. So yes, they may partially use that water resources, but they did not restore full operational capability of that canal.
Got it.
That is why it doesn't make any sense for Ukrainians to attack and exhaust their quite limited ammunition and artillery options to attack that facility, I can say.
So there's a lot of talk in the West here that, maybe if Ukraine is successful in its counteroffensives, that maybe it would stop at February 24 borders. But you said something really interesting at the beginning. You basically are implying that if Melitopol is retaken, then the next target may be Crimea, not an attempt to take Mariupol from a sort of priorities, and that Crimea is going to be a key focus for Ukraine. Is that because of the logistics that the Russians have in Crimea? And what about the difficulty of retaking that peninsula given its size and the fact that you have now a lot of Russians that have been imported there? You have some people that used to be Ukrainians but have now switched sides effectively, and will they put up a resistance if you actually attempt to invade?
No. This is a question. I am absolutely confident. I have to repeat. I am absolutely confident. Local population will not resist against the Ukrainian offensive in Crimea. Also, my confidence based on the historical examples, and the specific of Crimea as a geographical territory is limited capabilities to conduct any defensive actions over there. There were 3 offensives in Crimea during the 20th century. 1920 by Red Army. Crimea resisted, if I'm not mistaken, 2 weeks only. In 1991,
and by the way, in that time you had significant white forces, right, Tsarist forces based in Crimea, so it wasn't like there was no one to resist the Red Army invasion. in 1920.
Absolutely. White forces resisted desperately over there, but because of there is no even one single line where we can stop offensive running from north in Crimea. It is even technically impossible to create any lines of defense over there, which may ensure that you will keep those lines. The same story was in 1941, when Soviet forces in Crimea were much bigger to compare with Germans. Did it stop Germans? No. And the same story in 1944, which looks like a crystal example what could happen in case of Ukrainian offensive there. Why? Because of Soviet army cut it off Crimea from all lines of and chains of supply and communications over there. They block it, create like a real Crimea island, which we are going to do in the same way. Cutting off supply lines from Mariupol, cutting off supply lines coming from Crimea Bridge. So, in fact, it will be like a Crimea island. And keeping of Crimea as a part of Russian defense will not make sense. Right now, and moreover, it's like we are not talking about like immediate advance of Ukrainian forces deeply inside of Crimea, but you can imagine, and I mentioned it already, that Ukrainian forces will appear on the seaside of Azov Sea, on the shore of Azov. So, what it will mean? What will it mean? It will mean that Ukrainian forces will deploy anti-ship missiles to Azov shore, to Azov coasts, and we will influence to the position of Russian forces in Azov and Black Sea. That is why we didn't mention, but it is quite important portion of our activity is the Kinburn Peninsula in Mykolaiv and Kherson.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask about that because the prevailing wisdom is that can be spent and the peninsula is not really defendable because it's under fire control from the Russians.
Yeah, and the same stuff with Ukrainians. So because it means that no Ukrainian, no Russians can keep troops in Kinburn span or peninsula. What is the correct pronunciation? I can't remember. Well, excuse me.
Well, there's a spit, which is that very narrow piece, and then there's a broader
spit.
peninsula. Yeah.
Yes. Sometimes when colleagues ask me, could you describe the situation in Kinburn span? I said, listen, guys, you glance on the Zmini Island, Snake Island. It's the same. Flat lands, no hidden points where you can cover and protect your troops. So Ukrainian forces need just to push back Russian presence from the Spanto Peninsula, and this will be it from the perspective. In broader perspective, we could say the same about Crimea, using long-range missiles, artillery, and other stuff there. So right now, I can't say 100%, but we are able to keep under fire control one of the exits from Crimea.
With HIMARS.
With the HIMARS. And somehow we reached to the Genichsk and Novo-Alexeyevka and Chuguevka and other locations on other exit from Crimea. So you can imagine what will happen if we will advance in a direction of Melitopol and liberate Melitopol.
Well, you also somehow were able to hit several bases in Crimea itself, which is still puzzling to everyone else.
Absolutely correct. Yeah. Moreover, when I was mentioning about advance to the Azov Sea shore, it was the same idea, because it will expand our zone of influence to more bases and military objects in Crimea, Russian, which will make them absolutely vulnerable Russians created a huge network of military support and supply in Crimea, but it doesn't mean that they would be able to protect them.
So I want to be very clear.
The Russian troops in Crimea.
Sorry, I want to be very clear and kind of pinpoint you on this question. You believe that it makes sense for Ukraine to try to retake Crimea before trying to retake even some of the territory that was lost since February 24th, like Mariupol, because in part Mariupol is very close to the Russian border, Rostov, Taganrog, and the Russians could potentially resupply their forces there, right?
Absolutely. It makes sense from the political and military perspective. From political perspective, it will be a huge political impact to reputation of Kremlin regime. And who knows, retaking of Crimea may create some internal movements or even coup d'etat in Kremlin, which can stop or terminate, in most cases, that war.
And you're not worried about escalation, because I think in the West there's a lot of concern that this would trigger maybe even a nuclear response.
Please, no. Listen, there were so many red lines declared by Russians, which we already crossed, so I don't bloody care about it anymore. And coming back to Crimea from military perspective, don't forget about the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. So pushing back Russians from the military bases, fleet bases in Crimea, will put them in absolutely inconvenient and vulnerable situation because of in full capacity, Russian fleet does not able to operate from Northern Caucasus bases only, and it will mean common advantage for the most of Black Sea countries, because right now, using an umbrella of Ukrainian anti-ship missiles, we opened a so-called grain corridor from Ukraine to south, to east, and so on. And it will expand, liberation of Crimea will expand a safe zone in the Black Sea to prevent any pirate attacks of Russian fleets against cargo ships over there.
Yeah.
So, and it will make a Russian flank on the south very, very vulnerable. I'm talking about the North Caucasus and other regions in Russia itself.
So 2 last questions, Sergei. One is your assessment of Surovikin, since he's taking over as the commander of the operation on the Russian side. It seems like the Russians have turned off the stupid mode, or at least the stupidest mode that they've had since the beginning of this war, and he's done some capable things, building more defensive fortifications, withdrawing from their non-defensible position in Kherson. Do you feel like you're facing a much more capable ground commander than you have been since the start of this conflict?
Well, from the materialistic and communist perspective, as I studied during my military school, I have to say that individual in a history may play a role, but like a partial role or tactical role, something like that. But from the general perspective, as I mentioned before, there is only one capable general or real general in the Russian army, General Matrix or General Shablon, if I could use such a definition, because of Russian generals are prisoners of doctrine, of old doctrine, and even 2 or 3 of them, despite of their brilliant mind, are not able to change procedures.
Yeah, Shablon for our listeners is a Russian word for pattern, basically. So they follow patterns, right?
Yeah, pattern. Yeah. So, sorry. Yes, you're definitely right. So this is what I'm talking about. Yes, he may create some good stuff for Russian forces, but in general concept, from strategic perspective, he can't do much to turn the line of war in another direction.
And what do you make of the prospects for a Russian offensive? Zaluzhny seems to be really concerned about it. You do have more mobilized personnel that are flowing to the front lines, and potentially they could mobilize more people. Do you think that could have a difference for them? They're running out of ammunition now, as we've talked about. So a military that's so dependent on ammunition, even if you have lots of people, may not be able to advance as much as they could have, a year ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I totally agree with the concern of General Zaluzhny, because of, in fact, we still have quite strong enemies in front of us, and despite of some of our stupid guys share an idea that those troops are completely demotivated, it is not correct, because of propaganda achieves a result, and the most of Russian troops are highly motivated just to do their job, to try to destroy Ukraine. With that regard, we have to be very careful, and I still have a concern about the possible Russian offensive actions in different directions. But I have to emphasize different directions and not simultaneously. Because of, as we can see now, Russians are able to conduct quite limited offensive actions in different locations of a front line, but not able just to conduct comprehensive and full-scale offensive from different directions. Right now, despite of the deployment of a quite big number of troops, my main concern is about, as we discussed already, Svatove direction, where Russians are able to concentrate a lot of troops, and it looks reasonable because of they have a backup of Russian territory. So there is no limitation for them just to make a maneuver by forces, by armament and ammunition. So they may create such a big number of troops which may allow them just to conduct an offensive action there.
And the goal of that offensive would be to what? To retake Izum?
To Kharkiv, not only Izum, Kupiansk,
all the way to the north.
Move to north to Kharkiv, because Kharkiv remain a very important target for Russian occupation, and Kharkiv is the second city in Ukraine. And it's a huge industrial city. I have to say that right now Kharkiv do a great job repairing tanks and infantry battle vehicles.
So why wouldn't, if their objective is Kharkiv, why wouldn't they try to go across the border from Belgorod? Kharkiv is very close to the Russian border there. Why would you go all the way from the east?
But it is about the ability to concentrate their troops. I may re-ask you about the Chernigiv Oblast and Belarus. It's the same stuff, actually, because of, Russians having a clear strategic target as Kiev, as the capital of Ukraine, to capture it. They should concentrate their troops, but they will not do it. It's too late for them, because of they lost their chance, and now they are able just to create any potential threat for Ukrainian defensive line or Ukrainian territory from those locations where they have a presence of troops already.
So you're not concerned about it. You're not concerned about a new offensive from Belarus.
No, absolutely not. It's too late. Mm-hmm. Potentially, we may discuss the option of offensive from Belarus in a perspective, but not now. In next 1 or 2 months.
Yeah.
It's too late. It's too bloody late, because of I very carefully monitor and observe the situation with the deployment of Russian troops to Belarus, and after 2 months, even 3 months, since the mid of October, we have a deployment of if I'm not mistaken, 11, maybe 12,000 of Russian troops only, which is not enough to create a real threat for Ukrainian defensive position in the northern Ukraine. Moreover, another critical point for us just to pay attention to mobilization of Belarusian forces, but it may be done only in a cooperation and in conjunction with deployment of Russian troops. So, and I was quite concerned monitoring the situation in the first 10 days of December, when I suppose Belarusian de facto authority will declare a mobilization. They didn't do that. Why? Because of lack of Russian troops in Belarus. There is a huge difference. There is a huge difference in mentality of Belarusian and Russian society. Yes, Belarusian society was under high pressure of Russian propaganda. However, they do not have the same mentality as Russians have. So that is why the idea of a ground attack from Belarus to Ukraine using Belarusian forces does not have a huge support in Belarusian society.
Well, and there are real questions about the ability of the Belarusian military to actually execute offensive operations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. By themselves, separately from Russians, even after mobilization, they would be not able to do any offensive actions. They do not have enough capabilities. They do not have enough mobilization resources to do so. And frankly speaking, they don't have like a battle experience. Over the last 30 years, Belarusian armed forces did not participate even in a peacekeeping operation. They have no clue what does it mean, smell of gunpowder, in a real smell one. And so they can be used commonly with Russian forces. But Russians might be like a backbone of that offensive group of troops. Belarusians will be used as supporters. This is the first option. And second option, what is the reason to conduct such an offensive from Belarus? Will it get any advantages for attackers? No. It's too bloody late now because of, Ukrainian forces already prepared that zone for the battle. And they're ready for that. That is why I have no doubts that it will not be like a real offensive action, real offensive with a deep impact to the Ukrainian territory. It may be like a demonstrative, provocative actions, something like that, in order to keep additional Ukrainian forces in that direction, but not like a huge full-scale offensive from that direction. It's too late. Logistic is a key point of Russian weakness now.
Well, Sergei, this was absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you again for joining us. I know it's very late where you are now. We're recording it almost at nighttime for you, but really, really appreciate it. Really important to get this perspective to our audience. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome at any time.
Спасибо тебе от души, хлопок родной. Ждет Севастополь, Симферополь и Джанкой. Ведь украинский воин есть для вас родной. С криками странными, с бабами драными валит из Крыма орда в барак родной.